Hello everyone, it's GigaBeef here, and today we are taking this MCX that I picked up on Labs back to the workshop. So here we are with the MCX. The MCX has been a very popular weapon this wipe, partly because of the ammunition that you can get for it, CBJ in particular being very easily accessible on the traders and very, very powerful with 58 damage and 43 penetration. This makes it pretty powerful against most armors. Class 5 it will struggle with a little bit, but the way that the armor works now, most of the time you can just get around the sides of it and stuff. This is probably going to change when the armor system gets reworked, but that's for another video. So here, as I said, this gun actually isn't that bad when I looked into it. If you try to make the minimum recoil version of this, you end up with a vertical recoil of about 58. So there's not that much that you could do to the MCX that makes it really, really low on recoil. In the new recoil model, that also doesn't really matter as much. So the thing that we're going to mainly focus on today is on the ergonomics here, because with only 44 ergo, there's not actually that great. It doesn't matter too much, but you will be able to see at the end that there is a difference between the two, just in terms of the snappiness of the weapon. And I don't think you have to spend that much more to get it to somewhere where it's actually pretty good versus here where it's, fairly mediocre. But before we start putting any different parts on, I just want to point out here on the durability. So this is where I picked this gun up and I didn't even use it at this level. So this was used by the person that I was firing it, and down at 78.5 durability. Yes, this might have come from a rogue or a raider or something like that, but I really wouldn't use the MCX at this point. Just to also point out that the player that I took this from was level 46, I believe. So they definitely had access to all of the stuff in the game. They have max traders and that kind of thing. So they could easily have replaced this over and bought a new MCX lower to be able to fix this gun. And I think that that is highly, highly, highly recommended, because you just don't want to risk dying to something stupid. Now that the lowers have been added back, you can easily get a 24,000 lower from Skier, and this will allow you to fix the durability. You just replace all the parts over onto this lower piece here, one by one, and then you just dump the old one or sell it to Fens. There is nothing worse than dying to a random bullet jam if you're fighting a boss or a geared PMC or something like that. So you really want to minimize that if you can. I always try to keep my guns above 93 because that's the threshold where outside of heat, you can't actually get a gun jam. So above that, you're pretty much safe unless you're dumping multiple 60 rounders. But I think down at this level is definitely time to move over to another gun. Even for guns that aren't like the MCX and you can't just buy a lower, it's still probably worth buying another one. So let's look at what's actually good about this weapon. Well, in terms of the muzzle, there's not that much you can do with the MCX. You only really have the choice of either the SRD 762 suppressor, which is a standalone one. This one isn't really very good because it doesn't combine with a muzzle brake, so it doesn't get you that low in terms of recoil, and the ergonomics still isn't that good. The other alternative is the KAC QDC. This one sometimes lures people into thinking this is good because you can put the best in slot muzzle brake on the end here, but the issue with this is that because you can only use the flash suppressor kit and not the actual KAC muzzle brake on this gun, the combination ends up being worse than this, which is the T-lock combo. This is the one that I always talk about when we are looking at building the MCX. It's this one, the SRD 762 QD, the quick detach version, which goes on top of the T-lock, which inside also has the 2-port muzzle brake. So this combination is pretty powerful. You get 9% recoil reduction from this in particular, and you get 6 from this as well. So you end up with minus 15 overall. This is one of the reasons why the MCX ends up not getting as low as something like the M4 in terms of vertical recoil, simply because the muzzle brake isn't actually that powerful for reducing recoil in general. So that's completely fine. The barrel on this, we have the longer version of the MCX at the moment, which again I think is also fine. It doesn't really matter what you choose between these two. You only gain 2 ergonomics for going to the shorter barrel, and you lose 2% recoil reduction. So I feel it's worthwhile just having the longer version of the MCX, and typically the MCX comes with that as well. So this does make it very slightly cheaper. You can get both on the flea market. You can get either of these, the 171 or the 229, depending on which configuration it comes in. In general, I would say if you have an MCX already, you're probably worth just keeping on whichever barrel it has. It doesn't make enough difference to really swap, especially not in terms of the cost. But as we can see here, the standard version from Skier comes with the 229 barrels. This is probably the one that you're most likely to see, so I'm just going to keep it like that. One other part, this person here had the MCX front sight on as well as the rear sight. The front sight does actually give you +1 ergo, where the rear sight doesn't give you any at all. So you might want to swap that one over to something like the Chris Defiance if you want to get that +1 ergo benefit on the rear of the weapon too. But this is really a micro adjustment and doesn't matter that much, unlike the stock. So the stock here that they've used is something that I just don't really see very often, which is this particular folding stock adapter buffer tube, which attaches to the stock locking hinge assembly. Almost always when I've ever used the MCX, I use this thing, which is the retractable stock adapter, because this one that you've got here only lets you do very certain and specific things. When you're using this hinge, you can only use this Coyote Tan buffer tube, and onto that you can add the usual collection of things. But this is no better than just using the standard adapter and buffer tube combinations, such as, again, the stock adapter, and then something on there like, I don't know, the ADAR or the M4 carbine tube. That's 35 and 93, and this one here is 35 and 93 as well. So it's basically the same thing. So I always recommend on here using the retractable stock adapter, and on top of that, we're probably going to use the ARE. This is a lot more expensive, but I do think it is probably worth it. The ARE gives you certain bonuses, which are quite nice, like the 2 ergonomics and the 2% recoil. And on top of that, we can add a stock. Now, in this particular version, they had a grey MOE carbine stock on here and a rubber butt pad as well. And what I would prefer, especially on this gun, is, as we said, the vertical recoil, you can't really change it all that much. Down to 58 is as good as it can get. And this gun came in at around 62. So I'm always thinking in this case, what we're trying to target is ergonomics rather than recoil. So I prefer using the Daniel's Defense ECB. So there's 2 versions of these, the black one and then there's the tan one. You can use the black one here. And then you've also got the choice between the thicker version of the butt pad and the thinner version. The thin version just gives you recoil reduction for free. The thick version does give you a little bit more recoil reduction, but it hits your ergonomics. So I'm actually going to use the thin version here just to retain as much ergo as possible, because, as I said, it doesn't make that much difference what you do around these minor little tweaks. You won't be able to tell the recoil from one gun to the next, but you might be able to tell on the ergonomics once you've added everything together. So the next one is probably the foregrip here, but before we touch on that, let's look at the handguard, because we have to change that before we change the foregrip, otherwise we're going to delete it from the build. Now they've got a LasTac 2 on here, so we'll put that back on later. This is not a terrible flashlight by any means. It's fairly bright as per my flashlights testing video. It's not that bad. There are some others that I prefer, but the benefit of this is that this also gives you the bonus to point fire as well, which is very, very helpful being a flashlight. Something like the Predator is slightly better, but it doesn't give you a bonus to point fire, so you need to add like another laser or something on to make that work together in tandem. So the LasTac 2 is not a bad idea if you just want to have a flashlight, so we'll leave it, it's okay. What they do have on here is the MCX 12-inch handguard. Now, I don't think it's worth using this most of the time, because all you get, as you see, is a 1% recoil reduction and 6 ergo. If you swap this over to the shorter version, you then get 9 ergonomics, but lose that recoil reduction. But 1 for 3 is probably okay, to be honest with you. And you also lose a bit of weight as well. So I'm going to move down to this MCX 8-inch here. We'll stick the CASV 6-inch rail back on, and then we'll look at this. So they had on this guy, which is the AFG Black. Now, I don't know why you'd use this at such a high level, unless you literally just had it around. Again, it probably doesn't make that much difference, but if you're buying something from scratch, then I'd probably use the RVG Black at a bare minimum, because this gives you 1 more ergonomics than the AFG, and is, you know, the same in all other aspects. The RVG itself is only 1 ergonomics down from the SE5, which is quite a lot more expensive. You know, you're talking now 17,000 rubles versus about 10k for the RVG. And so for most players at the end of the wipe now, it doesn't really matter. So we're talking 1, 2, 3 points of ergonomics, which again is the reason why, you know, people just slapping on whatever they have in their stash. And I think you should probably use the RVG Black. If you're setting up a preset or something, then you may as well just do that, because it's just better. And you don't really lose much in terms of price particularly. I'm going to add this back on the MCX front sight here, and I'll put their LasTac 2 back on as well using a 2-inch rail. Okay. So at this point, we've got ourselves up to 55 ergonomics and 66 vertical recoil, which is okay, but we could do very slightly better than this as well. Let's look at the pistol grip. Now, the Orion is not bad. The Orion is actually all right. So in terms of budget upgrades to pistol grips, I often think of the OMRG. The Orion is 3 better than that, and the other one is the Stark AR, and that one is 1 better than that as well. And so the only upgrade that you're really going to get from here is going to one of these things like the F1 ST2, which is the same, the one with the paracord on it, which is 1 better, or the Growl and the Ergo foregrip, this thing. So I usually stick the Growl onto everything. Again, at this level, when you've got max traders, I wouldn't do anything other than adding the Growl. It's another 3 ergonomics over the top of the Orion. The reason why they haven't used something like the ST2 is that this is 17,000 rubles, and the Orion is actually a pretty reasonable 15k instead. So as a budget part, it's kind of alright, but I think if you're already spending 15,000 rubles on the Orion, then you may as well just use the Growl, because this is about 20k instead, maybe a little bit more. And you're getting 3 ergonomics extra, which is a pretty big deal when you're talking an incremental upgrade of maybe about 8,000 rubles, which in itself is nothing at this point in the wipe. So the final thing that I want to talk about with this build is the choice of the magazine. I'm definitely not opposed to 40 rounders. I actually quite like them. But the thing is, if you're using them alongside a build with low ergonomics, then you're going from -3 ergonomics on a regular mag down to -7, which is hitting you by another 4. And you can't really afford it. If you're down in that level, our original build, for example, has 44 ergonomics. And so you're not really at the point where you're able to make that trade-off. Whereas once you're up at 58 or something with the magazine, you feel a lot more comfortable running it with this weapon. Yes, this means that you need to have something else with your rig. You either need to be using like the Osprey or one of the Alpha chest rigs, or even the CSA if you want to go super budget. But up at 58 ergonomics, I feel very confident with the handling of this weapon using the 40 rounders, whereas I wouldn't be if I was, around 40 or something on ergonomics. So I went and I basically rebuilt this gun myself. I ended up using the black version of the magazine, and I put on an SE5 in the end just to get us to kind of the best version possible. This is a little bit more expensive than the builds that we already had, the quick difference between this and this, but it's not actually that much, especially at this point in the wipe. And we're going to go and see in the hideout. I'll show you the difference between the two guns, and you'll see on recoil it doesn't really make that much difference. Technically speaking, we've actually made the recoil worse on this weapon, which is sort of interesting. So let's go and check out both of these over in the shooting range. Now, you'll see that there's very little difference between the recoil patterns, but it's more about the ergonomics. So this is their weapon here, which is fine. It's one of the reasons why people quite like the MCX these days. And this is mine. So the recoils are technically slightly worse on my version, but you can't tell at all. Now, their one on ergonomics, when we're scoping in, even without using an LPVO or anything, then you can see it's not sluggish, but there's just a little bit of a delay before you actually fully get your screen covering over the end of the target. And with my one, it's a lot snappier. Like, that's probably double the ADS speed. It's a lot quicker. It feels much better. A lot of the things about these weapons, it's not always about the numbers. Sometimes it's just about the feel. This feels so much easier. If you're, leaning a corner and then you just have to suddenly snap on target, you feel like you're in control of the weapon rather than the weapon kind of dictating how you play, which is the way I'd like to have it with a CQB style weapon like this. This is important as well when you're using LPVOs, so you don't want to have that feel sluggish at all, because you've got more time between you pressing the button and then being able to actually see down the optic. So, it's not sluggish, it's not that bad, but you can see there's a little bit of a lag time, a little bit of a delay as the target comes into view. Whereas with the other version, it just feels very, very snappy. The difference is quite noticeable, I would say, between the two versions, and I just feel so much more confident being able to snap onto players or scavs very quickly while using an LPVO with the slightly better configuration. So I think it does show that there is a reason to do this, especially late white when money is so easy and so plentiful to come by. Even if you don't necessarily have the Bitcoin farm, you benefit from it simply because everybody has tons of money, and most items are now 20k at least per slot, even food items and things like that. So the economy is kind of crazy. You can buy this stuff pretty easily, and money shouldn't really be an issue. It's more likely to be an issue with trader levels than anything else. If you haven't checked out my flashlights guide yet, then please go do so. Otherwise, as usual, a big shout out to all my patrons, and as always, have fun in your raids.